So the nerve fibers that leave the sympathetic chain can follow three different routes. The first route is known as the spinal nerve route. The postganglionic fibers exit the ganglion either by the way of the gray ramus. So this nerve over here, so this ramus means a branch. So this branch over here is called the gray ramus. And then you have the white ramus. So the gray and white ramus are called the communicating rami. They're called the communicating rami because they help in conveying nerve impulses of the autonomic division, specifically for the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. Don't worry about remembering this too much. Just focus on the roots. So let's get back. So the nerve fibers that leave the sympathetic chain can follow three routes. The first route over here is the spinal route. So some nerve fibers exit the ganglion through the gray ramus, and then return to the spinal cord or the spinal nerve or the subdivision. And then they travel all the way to the target organ, okay? So they can either return to the spinal nerve or they just go elsewhere and they finally reach the target organ. And the target organs in spinal nerve route is usually the sweat glands, the piloerector muscles, and the blood vessels of the skin and skeletal muscles. So that is the first route. That is the spinal nerve route. So you might want to write this down. This is the spinal nerve route. Okay. And the second route is called the well, there's a pen. It's called the, so that's the second route, sympathetic nerve route. Now, the sympathetic nerve route is a type of route wherein some nerve fibers end up traveling either up or down the sympathetic ganglion chain, and some of them form cardiac plexus. If you remember from the previous chapter, a plexus, let me write that down too if you don't remember. So these form cardiac plexus. A plexus is a network of intersecting sympathetic nerves that run parallel to the carotid artery, and then they end up innervating structures like the sweat gland, salivary gland, piloerector muscles, blood vessels, and the pupils of the eye. Okay. So this is the only route by which the cervical, sacral, and coccygeal levels, all of them receive input. Okay. So the sympathetic nerve route is a very important route because the cardiac nerves get innervated by the sympathetic nerve route. Keep in mind that the cardiac nerves also contain parasympathetic nerves because if you need to increase the heart rate, you need something to control the heart rate just so you don't get hypertensive, right? So the cardiac muscle and the cardiac tissue contain both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The third route is known as the splanchnic nerve route. The splanchnic nerve routes, some of the fibers that emerge from the spinal nerves pass through the ganglia. So you see these ganglia over here. So they just pass through the ganglia without synapsing with another nerve. So just move on further and then they form another ganglia away from the paravertebral ganglia where they form a synapse in another ganglia, okay, away from the vertebrae. So this is called the collateral ganglion. Okay, so that's the collateral ganglion. And this is where the preganglionic fibers synapse with postganglionic fibers. Okay, if you didn't understand this, keep in mind there's a paravertebral chain over here. So there's a sympathetic ganglionic chain that runs alongside the vertebrae. Most nerves synapse over there. Most preganglionic nerves synapse with the postganglionic nerve in the paravertebral ganglia. But some nerves just pass through these ganglions without synapsing. They just move farther away from the vertebrae and synapse in another ganglion known as the collateral ganglion. Okay, so the splanchnic nerve root is responsible for innervating the liver, the spleen, the adrenal glands, the stomach and intestine, the kidney, urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and so many more. Okay, so know the three roots of the sympathetic nervous system, and understand that the cardiac plexus is important for innervating the heart. The cardiac nerves also contain the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so keep that in mind, and also know the difference between the splanchnic nerves and the collateral ganglia. The splanchnic nerves are the nerves that pass through the T5, specifically T5 to T12 vertebrae without synapsing with another nerve, and they lead to another set of ganglia known as the collateral ganglion away from the sympathetic chain ganglia. I know there are a lot of terms over here, so the more you get familiarized with this term, the easier it'll become. So what are we looking at? Let's get a perspective of what this is first. That's the spinal cord. This is the posterior aspect, anterior aspect. These are the lateral horns. You only find the lateral horns in the thoracic to lumbar vertebrae, T1 to L2 vertebrae. Okay, so that's the lateral horn, where you find the efferent nerves of the autonomic nervous system. And these in green are the preganglionic fibers that originate from the central nervous system. These nerve fibers are highly myelinated. The preganglionic fibers synapse with postganglionic fibers in the paravertebral ganglion, which are present right alongside the vertebrae. The neuron in red is the postganglionic nerve fiber that carries the signal from the ganglion to the effector organ. Now, in a sympathetic nervous system, you have several things that happen. When you get startled, your blood vessels constrict. It increases your blood pressure and heart rate. Your breathing increases, and your metabolic rate increases. The breakdown of glucose to release energy also increases. Okay, and when all of this happens, it creates a fight or flight response. You get startled, and you get little goosebumps sometimes, right? So you get suddenly alert. So all of this is going on when the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in immediately, and all of this happens in a fraction of a second. So let's see how this works. You get startled by a barking dog. You immediately get startled, so you get shocked, right? So the first thing that happens is the brain sends down the signal down the spinal cord and the preganglionic nerve fibers. The preganglionic nerve fibers release acetylcholine at the axon terminal in the synaptic cleft, which is present in the ganglion. This generates an action potential because ACH stands for acetylcholine. Acetylcholine. Okay, that's ACH. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter, and you have heard of this before when you were looking at the neuromuscular junction. All right. So the postganglionic nerve fiber receives the action potential, and it transmits the action potential down the axon all the way to the effector. In this case, the effector is the cardiac muscles and the smooth muscles and glands. And at the effector, norepinephrine is released. Okay. Now, when norepinephrine is released, your heart rate increases, your blood vessels constrict, your breathing increases, your metabolic rate increases, and you break down more sugars to gain more energy so that you can run for your life, correct? And all of this happens in a fraction of a second. Now, one thing to note over here that NE stands for norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is also a neurotransmitter when it is released by the axon terminals. Okay, and keep in mind that you'll not have any other neurotransmitter right over here, because norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that is always released by the postganglionic neuron in a sympathetic nervous system. Okay. Now, this is a sympathetic nervous system pathway to your heart, but simultaneously you will have another set of nerves leaving the spinal cord. I'm going to erase this so I can write over here. When another set of nerves leaves the spinal cord, it is going to carry signals to the skeletal muscles, and you run for your life. Okay, and this is what happens in a central sympathetic nervous system. It induces the fight or flight response. So let's quickly revise. What happens? What are the features of a sympathetic nervous system? When the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, the postganglionic nerve fibers release acetylcholine, transmit the nerve impulse. Oh, did I say postganglionic? Sorry, preganglionic. Let me repeat that. So, when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, the preganglionic nerve fibers release acetylcholine. The postganglionic nerve fibers always release norepinephrine. Now, this is important. Make sure you remember that. Now, when the nerve impulses reaches the glands, specifically the adrenal glands secrete adrenalins like norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, you've heard of the adrenal rush. It's really these hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine, that in turn helps in constricting the blood vessels, constrict blood vessels. When the blood vessels constrict, it increases blood pressure, it increases the heart rate, and it also acts on the lungs. So you increase breathing, you breathe faster. When all of this is going on, you need a lot of energy. So the metabolic rate increases. And you also increase glucose breakdown to release ATP. And for glucose, you need to induce the liver to release more glucose. So all of this is going on within a fraction of a second, and you have no control over it. Imagine. All right, so let's look at the innervation in the sympathetic division. Now keep in mind, this is a simplified diagram. You have a paravertebral ganglia on both sides of the spinal cord, and each spinal nerve carries postganglionic sympathetic fibers to the body wall, limbs, and mostly the visceral organs. Now, let's focus on some important nerves emerging in the sympathetic nervous system. So the first group I want to look at is the cervical sympathetic ganglia. So cervical means the head and neck, right? That's what you think when you think cervical region. Is cervical means the neck. Okay, so the nerves from here have something to do with the head and neck and the face. So the postganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers from the cervical sympathetic ganglion region supply the regions that are supplied by the cranial nerves, number 3, 7, 9, and 10. And if you remember from the previous chapter, I'm going to write it down. Cranial number 3, 7, 9, and 10. Number 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Number 7 is the facial nerve. Number 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. And number 10 is the vagus nerve. So just remember these nerve numbers, because these are very, very important in the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so nerve from the cervical sympathetic ganglia supply the same regions that are supplied by these 4 nerves. Okay, and then we need to look at the splanchnic nerves. So there are 4 important groups of splanchnic nerves. The first one is the cardiopulmonary splanchnic nerve. It's called the cardiopulmonary splanchnic nerve because they supply the heart and the lung. Cardio has something to do with the heart, and pulmonary means the lungs. Okay, so the cardiopulmonary nerves supply the heart and the lungs. And then you have the greater and lesser, lumbar and sacral splanchnic nerves. The greater and lesser and the lumbar splanchnic nerves supply a whole lot of different regions in the abdominopelvic region. So they help in controlling digestion, the blood supply in the mesenteric artery, etc. And then a whole bunch of nerves from the sacral splanchnic nerve groups are supplied to the postganglionic fibers below the L2 region, mainly to the pelvic structures that include the urinary bladder, the penis and scrotum, ovary, uterus, etc. So now that we know what structure sympathetic nervous system innervates, let's look at the effects of the sympathetic nervous system on certain structures. The sympathetic nervous system stimulates dilation of the pupils. Okay, so when you get startled, you become more alert and your pupils get dilated. And it stimulates the secretion of thick and viscous saliva. And then you become sweaty and anxious, okay, because it also activates the sweat glands in the skin, okay. And then your heart rate increases, you breathe faster because it causes bronchodilation. So it dilates your lung structure, so you can, or the bronchioles, so you can breathe easily. And then what else does it do? It stimulates the release of glucose into the bloodstream so we can make more energy. And the other structures that it affects is the urinary bladder, the penis and scrotum. So the sympathetic nervous system is also active during ejaculation or during the contraction of vagina. And the other structure that it also innervates, we didn't talk about, is, well, the skin, right? It does, it stimulates the sweat glands, so you become sweaty, but the other muscles that it stimulates also the erector pili muscles. The erector pili muscles are the hair that stand up when you get goosebumps. So these muscles get contracted when the sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and sometimes when you get startled, you say, I got goosebumps because you got your sympathetic nervous system activated. Okay, so just focus on the basic effects on the sympathetic nervous system, the splanchnic nerve groups, and the type of regions that the sympathetic nervous system innervates in the cervical and the facial regions.